Hey readers, welcome back to Reading Realm and the first review of the year. I'm very excited to talk about this one because it is actually quite different than a lot of her other books. This is The Cellar by Natasha Preston, which I talked about as being one of the books that I'm carrying over from last year that I was in the middle of reading. This book was surprising in a lot of ways. And I think the biggest one that I need to talk about first is the ending. This is the first and only Natasha Preston book where the ending was completely fine. Like, the ending, I mean, obviously, not everything was 100% better. Like, it wasn't super, like, everyone's happy and everyone's totally fine at the end, because that's not the style of book this is, but and one of the characters even says, like, happily ever after for all time is for fairy tales, and that's not what this is, or something like that. So but it ends in a way that feels like an actual ending to a book and not like a cliffhanger you would leave if you're writing a sequel or another chapter, which is kind of the problem that I have with a lot of her other books. Is the endings are always so frustratingly bad. And, like, I think that's part of her branding, is that the endings are like that often. But this one was really surprising that it wasn't. Like, I got to a certain point when things were starting to feel a little bit resolved, and I was like, okay, well, there's still a few more pages, so obviously something bad's gonna happen again. And then when it didn't really happen, I was like, oh, okay, so the ending of this book is just an ending of the book. It isn't some horrible cliffhanger again. So, the ending of this book was actually good. Like, it felt like an ending, and I didn't feel like throwing the book across the room. I felt like, oh, like, this is actually a resolved ending, which is kind of not been how I've felt with almost any of her other books. There have been two where I was like, I guess I could, like, write a new chapter mentally for myself that would make it okay, but this one I don't even have to do that. Like, it's just resolved. Or, like, not that every situation has been resolved, but that, like, it doesn't feel like a really bad cliffhanger. And there is still, like, an ominous sort of overhanging thing on the last page that she mentions, but it's not, like, an immediate thing, so it's kind of like, compared to the other ones where, like, one of them, the last word of the book is bang from a gun, and then another one, it's, like, being dragged away and, like, stuff like that. This is a completely fine ending, which is honestly very surprising. I was not expecting that, knowing her other books, but I also do feel like this is possibly one of her earlier books. Its copyright is 2014, so it might be that she started doing that style of ending later into her writing career. So this might have been before that, or maybe she hadn't made that her sort of signature finishing move, I guess, of ending books with horrific cliffhangers by the time that this was published. So, I don't know if this was her first book, but it at least was one of the early ones. On the inside cover, it says that the other books by her are Awake, The Cabin, You Will Be Mine, and The Lost, which I've read 3 of those, and I'm about to start Awake. So with the other 3, The Cabin is one of the ones where the ending isn't as bad. But the other 2 have pretty bad endings. But I will say, I also don't know when this was added, that these are other books by her, so it could be that they were written after, I'm not sure. But this book was actually one that I felt like, it didn't sort of cheat the reader out of an ending, which some of her others sort of do, because they leave it feeling so unfinished and so unresolved that it's like, well, that's how you end a book? But this one was good. This one, I am pleasantly surprised, which I was really not expecting it. Like, up until the time I flipped the page and was like, okay, all that's left in this book is a preview of one of her other books, I was like, okay, when's the bad thing gonna happen? When's the cliffhanger gonna happen? And it didn't. So, I liked that about this book. And I will say, I should probably say this before I go any further into the video. I did mention that one of the reasons I was really slow into starting this book was that someone I know who had also read it mentioned some of the stuff that happens in this one. So if intimate abuse is a triggering thing for anyone, this book does have that. And intimate assault as well. So that's one of the things where it's like, I thought it would be written more graphically than it is. It isn't as bad as I thought it would be to read, but I know that could still potentially be triggering or distressing for someone to read. But it's more like really strongly implied what's happening, and then you see the aftermath rather than having a really vivid description of the whole scene. So that is the one reason why I was kind of like hesitating on reading this, because I was like, I don't know if I want to read about that right now. But once you get past that part, it's very interesting. I think this one is also interesting because it's written in a very different perspective way than any of her other books that I've read. There have been some of her books where they do split perspectives and they show sort of the protagonist and then the antagonist's perspective, and stuff like that has been in her books before, but this one is really interesting because it shows the protagonist's perspective, her boyfriend's perspective, the antagonist's perspective, but it also shows different temporal perspectives because it will go to like a flashback from years ago and then jump forward to the present, even in the same chapter, or it will switch between like either a flashback that the character's thinking about, or like a chapter will be set in the past and show backstory of something, and then it will go back to the present, the next chapter, or something, which is really interesting, and especially the fact that the antagonist gets a lot of backstory and past things. Like, his behavior in this book is in no way justified, but it's really interesting to see sort of the psychological effect of his past and how that's affecting him and his actions, and why to him what he's doing is justified, even if legally or ethically it's absolutely not justified, which I think is really interesting because even in the other books, when it does show the antagonist's perspective, I feel like it's never really gone so much into why they are the way they are and justifying that reason of why they are what they are, which makes this one definitely really, really interesting to read. And it's especially interesting to read sort of the way that the character, I feel like in all the other books, even when you have the perspective of the antagonist, it's very much like, okay, you see them in their perspective when they're plotting this specific thing related to what's happening that the protagonists are aware about the bigger thing that's happening, and it's plotting toward that. And in this one you see some of that, but you also see like his mundane day at work and stuff like that, where it's just very interesting because you're getting a sense of his life in a way that the protagonist never gets at all. which I think is definitely a really, really interesting way of writing it, especially compared to her other books, because it just seems like something that none of her other books have done for their protagonists, at least not the ones that I've read. So, I am actually pleasantly surprised with this book. I definitely think it's very different um than some of her other books, both in the perspectives and also what's happening, because the I need to be careful because of spoilers, but basically the other books are always more like the protagonist is out being like surrounded by this overhanging thing of like there's a serial killer or something, in a lot of the other books, not all of them, but trying to kind of stay safe and figure that out, but still being able to like be at home and go out around town and stuff. And in this one, if you couldn't tell by the title, they are in a cellar for almost all of the book. So it's definitely very different in that perspective as well, because the sort of world that the protagonist has in it is so much smaller, and I kind of think that might be why there is more flashback stuff in this book, especially pertaining to her, because it's like that's the only time when she can go into those memories to kind of be outside of the cellar and sort of isolate the experience of the person who's trapped versus like herself. And it's very interesting, sort of the whole psychological aspect of this one, both for the antagonist and sort of why he is that way and the justification that he has, and how like his past trauma kind of created what he is, even though I don't think that he's justified, even though you do have that backstory. And then also, I think it's fascinating the way the different people who are in the cellar react, because they all sort of have different reactions to it, and some of them are adapted way better than others. And I will say, and I'll just leave this very, very simply because I don't want to give away too much, but the storyline about Rose and who she is and why she behaves the way that she does is really fascinating. And I think it's definitely a thing where it's like the psychology behind all of this is just really, really interesting, and in a way where it's like you do feel bad for all of them, even though their experiences are different, but in a different way sometimes. But I actually really like this one. I feel like this is the first Natasha Preston review I've done where I'm not like, the ending was the worst thing I've ever seen. This one was actually just really interesting and really good, and I feel like the ending, I was just always expecting something bad to happen, and it didn't. But I will say, again, if intimate assault or kidnapping or anything like that could be a trigger for you, maybe don't read this one, because that does happen. And I definitely do think that the way it's written is doing it in a way where it's not, the sun just got super bright outside, where it's not too graphic, but it definitely deals with sort of the emotions of what happened and the aftermath of that. And so that could be potentially triggering, and I'm aware of that. So don't read this book if that would be a problem for you. But overall, I think out of all of her books, this one's the one where it's like, you could read this and not be left really upset with the ending. Like, this is one where it's actually a perfectly fine ending. Like, it's still kind of like not 100% everything's back to normal and everything's fine, but it's also not like everything's going to die in the next 5 seconds or is actively dying. So I definitely think that this is possibly one of her better books just because of the way the ending is. But I hope you liked it. Let me know if you've read this book, and also what you're planning to read this year, or if you want to read this book, because it's definitely interesting. But let me know in the comments, and please subscribe if you haven't. It really helps me out, and keep reading. Bye!